Welcome to the second edition of Silicon Bytes, back by popular demand. This is the format where we dive into some of the key news stories of the week. We don't look at the ebb and flow of the battles inch by inch, day by day. Rather, we try to look at some of the big trends taking place in Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the US. So here are some of the stories this week that really stand out. So first, we take a rundown of the Moscow Times. The Moscow Times is one of the best sources of information that does sort of deep dives into stories that often will not appear in the mainstream Western media. And this one here, fear and frustration in Moscow as air defense systems deployed. Now, some of you may have seen this as memes. This is where the anti-aircraft missile systems have been spotted across Moscow in recent weeks, including on the roof of the Defense Ministry building. Bizarre as it is to see large vehicles with tires on top of buildings. This, however, seems to have caused some consternation amongst local officials. All of these systems have been placed around Moscow without any notifications to local people, appearing in parks at the top of the buildings and so on. As the war reaches into its 11th month, 5 anti-aircraft systems have been spotted across Moscow, and rather than being a reassuring presence, it seems they have caused some consternation and worry. Another trend that may not have been quite so widely reported in the Western media is the flower protests that are spreading across Russia, apparently in 60-odd cities. In this protest, makeshift displays of flowers, stuffed toys, and handwritten notes have sprung up in at least 60 cities across Russia. Often they're placed by statues with some connection to Ukrainian culture. For instance, Ukrainian poets Taras Shevchenko and Lesia Ukrainka, or next to monuments of victims to Soviet-era political repression. The Moscow Times reports here that it's a statement against the war. It's not just mourning for the people who died, for instance, in the Dnipro apartment attacks. This is when this protest really seems to have gained some momentum. And that statement that it's against the war is taken from a woman who laid flowers at the site of one of the memorials in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk. I mean, of course, anyone who is openly in public placing flowers or making any kind of statement at all is putting themselves at risk. No doubt they'll be photographed, potentially sort of followed, or even demanded that they hand over their identity details. So there's a certain amount of individual bravery here. On the other hand, it's a relatively passive protest. I mean, you could argue that it's very difficult to mount anything else in the current circumstances, but it does feel a little on the passive side, and one wonders whether it will actually lead to any changes at all. Another story that caught my eye in the Moscow Times is that Russia is to nationalize Ukrainian assets in annexed Crimea. Now, this only gets a couple of paragraphs, probably because information is quite scant on it at the moment. On Friday, a Russian government official announced that it will nationalize frozen assets in annexed Crimea, including those with any link to Ukrainian ownership, and it will funnel some of those funds towards fighting people in Ukraine, i.e. it will go towards the army, towards equipment and supplies. You know, this may not be a huge surprise, and in wartime, these sort of things happen, but I think it's indicative of the Russian slide into lawlessness, and it's also indicative of Russia's detachment from the international rules-based system and the international financial order. It's one more step towards potentially the full nationalization of all foreign assets within Russia. That's a step they haven't fully taken yet, but that will make it so much harder for Russia to re-enter the international financial system, whether it be later this year, next year, or 5 years' time, whenever it seeks to do so. This will, of course, be a complex legal barrier that will require considerable unpicking. Now let's turn to the Financial Times. Ukraine warns against complacency in the face of Russian threat. Now, this is an interesting announcement from President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that the country cannot afford to have any kind of weakness. And by weakness here, he means citizens letting their guard down, potentially relaxing slightly. He says that he's seen signs, or his administration has seen signs, that in some cities people are letting their guard down despite the ongoing hostilities. And this is a weakness that Ukraine cannot afford at this time. He's compared this to the start of the war when the spirit was strong, and he claims that he sees that in some cities people are at rest. It has to be said there are a lot of people who are not at rest. There are a lot of people who are extremely active, both in supporting the administration, in fighting, and of course engaging in civil society activities. However, 1 year in, I guess it's not surprising that a fair amount of exhaustion and, of course, extreme, mental health issues almost certainly are creeping in because people have been under tremendous strain in the most difficult circumstances, and the constant air raid sirens, constant cuts to electricity supply. All of these things must be extremely wearing on people's spirits. Another story from the Financial Times: the Battle of Bakhmut nears a tipping point as Russia intensifies its offensive. So the story describes that the city has not yet been cut off and the decision to withdraw has not been made, but potentially that is imminent. It's reaching a tipping point. And as we know, Ukrainian forces have been sort of very smart in conserving the lives of their troops as well as equipment, and they will tend not to fight to the last man. They will fight until it's clear that they can degrade Russia's numbers and equipment. They will inflict as much loss as they can and try to minimize the loss against themselves. Nevertheless, it must be reaching a point now where that equation starts to break down and it becomes as costly for the Ukrainians to retain Bakhmut as it is for the Russian troops to attack it. And of course, the main supply line is under severe pressure as there is a single main artery heading out of that city, which of course must be under constant fire. If any of you watch John Sweeney, he's also spoken about this in his most recent war diary. And if you haven't been following his war diaries, it's well worth seeking those out and watching them every day. You can find him on LinkedIn, and he's also on Twitter, as well as other channels, Telegram as well, I believe. Now we turn to The Economist. Ukraine's troops in the east are quietly confident, says The Economist. They believe they can hold the Russians off. They interview a commander there, a Colonel Maestro, who is based in the Kupiansk sector in eastern Ukraine, who's been fighting the Russians since they first invaded in 2014. His car apparently has a Elon Musk Starlink satellite dish attached to it, which is now ubiquitous along the front lines. And he is also in command of a drone intelligence team, and claims here that they can watch what the enemy is doing on the other side of the lines in real time. One night this week, he monitored 30 Russian men being sent forward. 2 of them were killed. When this happened, the rest marched on regardless, did not bolt for cover, did not show any kind of military awareness in how to proceed. And in the end, 9 died. They have no regard for their own lives, he says, or they were on drugs. And I think this is almost certainly indicative of the minimal training that Russian troops have been given and the absolute contempt that the Russian command have for their own troops. Potentially, these may have been prisoners, they may have been morbiki, and there clearly is a high degree of contempt. Probably from the commanders, certainly from the leadership. They may well be contempt from more seasoned soldiers or professional soldiers as well, who these morbiki potentially put them at risk through their lack of understanding or knowledge of how to behave on the front line. Now, there's a fascinating story in The Economist here, and this one also will relate to an interview that's going to be published on the channel next week about how Russia dodges oil sanctions on a vast scale, on an industrial scale. As another embargo looms, the grey trade in oil and other commodities is about to explode. In the year since the war in Ukraine began, the once dominant Western firms have pulled back from trading, shipping, and insuring Russian oil. In their place, mysterious newcomers have helped to sell the company's crude oil. They're based not in Geneva, but in Hong Kong and Dubai. Many have never dealt in these things before. And the article goes on to describe in some detail how the global energy system is becoming dispersed, divided, dangerous, and of course, a decreased lack of transparency as these new intermediaries trade in Russian oil. And no doubt, Russia is making a lot less money off these trades. Intermediaries will be taking a much bigger cut. And of course, in terms of logistics, it's far more expensive doing it this way than pumping it through the pipelines and the previous routes that would have existed, including more sort of mainstream shipping routes. Nonetheless, it means that Russia is still receiving revenue on potentially a vast scale in order to fund its war machine. Now, as I say, we'll have a full interview with one of the world's leading experts in the energy sector coming onto the channel next week. And before we move on to the next segment, here's two final stories. Again, we're looking at the Economist for these. So there is a campaign to de-Russify Ukraine. Now, it has to be said, this is not a state-sponsored persecution, not at all. That is not how the Ukrainian government has ever behaved, despite many of the sort of Vatnik claims to the contrary. Nonetheless, the popularity of Russian has dropped. The popularity of Russian books in the Russian language has apparently collapsed. But of course, many people whose first language was Russian, and they would have understood Ukrainian perfectly, but maybe preferred to read literature in Russian, that's starting to change. Many people are choosing to speak Ukrainian, to learn Ukrainian, and switch how they do business into Ukrainian. That is, I think, natural under the trauma of invasion. And of course, any sympathy for Russian culture, that was certainly widespread as you headed further east prior to the war, prior to this war and prior to 2014 as well. Russia has frittered away that goodwill, and it's quite understandable why people would now be sort of turned off that in the current circumstances. It means, of course, that there is a huge number of Russian books, and there is insufficient paper to print and support the huge demand for Ukrainian language materials. So many of these Russian books and materials are being pulped to create the raw material to produce new books in Ukrainian, or, as the article says here, cheap toilet paper, which is quite ironic. And finally, for this look at the news, a story that has really been overshadowed by the events in Ukraine and the repeated sort of threats that Russia's made, nuclear threats and so on, is the status of Georgia. Now, Georgia has let in many tens of thousands of Russians. They have had a destabilizing effect to an extent on society, as you may have seen in the excellent interview with James Bruno. We go into a lot of detail. He just came back from that region with some absolutely fascinating insights about that. Now, the West once saw Georgia as a beacon of liberty. It saluted its democratic reforms under the leadership of a restless reformist president, Mikhail Saakashvili. Georgia was a strong partner of the US. Now, of course, we also know that Georgia was invaded in 2008 and now is treading a very fine line of trying not to antagonize Russia, while at the same time trying to win some kind of concessions to draw a line under that war that happened a couple of years ago. But also something that has not received a huge amount of attention is that same Mr. Saakashvili is under guard in hospital on the outskirts of Tbilisi. He is apparently fighting dementia and muscle atrophy. Now, if you see photos of him a year ago, he does not look in any way ill at all. But it is reported that he is in a very grave state, terrible symptoms, and desperate memory loss. Mr. Saakashvili believes that he's been poisoned and says that he lapsed briefly into a coma during an earlier move from a different prison hospital. In December, a legal team appointed by him managed to get a toxicology report that was said to identify presence of heavy metals in his body, and the toxicologist expressed the opinion that he had been poisoned. He is, in effect, a prisoner of the current regime in Georgia. That same regime is trying to curry favor with the Kremlin. That's quite out of step, we believe, with many people living in Georgia who have a high degree of sympathy for Ukraine and the Ukrainian cause and are very well aware of Russian imperial aggression. Nonetheless, there is certainly the possibility that under the direction of the Kremlin, it may well be that yet another leader who has antagonized the Kremlin is receiving some kind of the vengeance of an unforgiving Kremlin. Now, before we take a deep dive into a number of longer articles, we're going to bring forward the segment where we look at some of the memes doing the rounds. And this week, I'm going to call that segment Vatnik Soup. One of the reasons for that is there seemed to have been a significant uptick this week of supporters of the Kremlin, fellow travelers, useful idiots, those expressing views which seek to perhaps distribute the blame for the invasion, thereby letting Putin off the hook. And a number of sources who monitor these things suggest there has been a huge spike in activity, as if there's some activation of voices. One of the fears is that that is happening ahead of a potential Russian offensive. We will cover this in more detail in another episode of Silicon Bytes, because so much is going on. I think we'll probably have to do 2 this week, so watch out midweek. There may well be another episode coming out. And one of the reasons suggested both for this activity, this propagandist activity, is that Russia might want to take advantage of the situation before Western tanks and armor, and potentially in a couple of months' time, planes even, actually join in the Ukrainian effort to fight back. At that point, gains will be far harder, and any kind of victory will be far less easy for the Kremlin to spin. It's also possible that Putin might want to go into some kind of negotiation after a nominal victory, rather than yet another round of defeat and ceding territory. So I think the memes this week have a particular edge to them, given the weaponization of the information sphere that we're seeing increase. Well, let's take a look at the memes. I think this one is absolutely self-explanatory, and it came out just after the announcement of the Challengers, Leopards, and Abrams. And here we have one poking fun at Dmitry Medvedev, who has gone on another series of insane rants this week, threatening Armageddon, making all sorts of terrible claims about the West. Really, I think the advice everyone would give to Dima is to stay off the booze, at least when he's in charge of a mobile phone and tweeting. This is one of my favorites, and it's something I think we will cover in a bit more detail in the next episode. But one of the most significant voices demanding peace is the infamous George Galloway. He was due to hold a conference this week at the Conway Hall with a number of other extremely vociferous voices opposed to the war, who, if one was to be uncharitable, could perhaps label as appeasers. They were due to hold a major anti-war conference. The venue, however, pulled out at the last minute, and there are some accusations that NAFO had involvement there, both complaining to the venue, and there have also allegations have been made about various threats. As I understand it, they are unsubstantiated, but it's a fairly toxic brew of allegations and counter-allegations. What it does show, I think, is that NAFO can be extremely effective, not just at posting memes online, but also have an effect in the real world. Some might say shutting down free speech. Some also might say that apologists for the Kremlin are potentially not free speech, but in some way paid for speech. Here's another raccoon meme. That's quite a funny one there. Slava Ukraini, Goroyam Slava. And again, this is referring back to the Kherson raccoon incident, which I'm sure you know. This is one of my favorites that I found. I don't know if it came out this week or not, but certainly it seems to summarize, well, the whole war and much of the Russian propaganda messaging that we've seen from people like Simonyan and Solovyov. And here you have the Russian monkey with a stick coming to wake the sleeping lion, which seems to be a particularly poor strategic idea. Let's end on a teaser for the next episode. Here's our famous NATO dog in the movie sequence there. Here's the last one. This is a NATO checkpoint. Show me your last meme. Well, in the next episode, there will be a lot more memes, and we'll be unpacking the evolution of this visual activist art form. So in this episode, there will, I'm sure you'll be sad to hear, no Clown World segment, but we will take a dive into Clown World as part of the NATO episode next week. Here we're going to look at 3 extensive articles, which I think are rather interesting and deserve a bit more of a deep dive. There will, of course, be links to all these materials in the description of the video. So if you find any of them interesting, do please click through and read them. So a topic that's been unfolding over the last 2 weeks and is absolutely fascinating is the process of Kiev stepping up its fight against corruption on the eve of the EU summit. So was this just a piece of window dressing to keep EU politicians happy and to smooth the way towards European entry? Or is this something far deeper and more significant? Well, I've taken this story from the English language edition of El País International, but of course this has been covered by many publications and covered it from a number of different angles. So what's happened? Well, there have been a series of raids against businesses and high-ranking officials that have been carried out as Volodymyr Zelensky cracks down on graft and corruption. Agents of the Prosecutor General's office searched offices belonging to businesses and high-ranking government officials allegedly linked to several illegal schemes. The most serious of these involves oil company Ukrotatnafta, of which the Ukrainian government is the majority shareholder, and from which it is suspected up to $1 billion may have been defrauded. In relation to this case, the Security Service of Ukraine searched the house of Ihor Kolomoisky, the company's former CEO. Now, this is quite a significant move because Kolomoisky is an oligarch from Dnipro. He's one of the richest men in Ukraine and has been a long-term financial supporter of the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, during his career as a television producer, actor, and above all, in his political ascent. So it's absolutely extraordinary that the state should move against this individual. No doubt there is a lot more going on behind the scenes than we're aware of. Well, what more should we expect to happen? Well, I think many more officials are going to come to light. They're going to be losing their jobs, potentially prosecuted. But what's most extraordinary about this is not that there's corruption in Ukraine. We know that. It's been known for the last 30 years that there is deep, deep political corruption and commercial corruption. And of course, this has provided fuel to the Kremlin propagandists, as if corruption was an excuse for the genocidal invasion, which of course it's not. But the other story here is that steadily Ukraine has been making progress to tackle corruption and to build institutions that are resilient enough to tackle corruption. This was never going to be an easy task. It was never going to be done overnight. It's a decades-long process. But it does seem the pressures of war have intensified and accelerated the development of civil and judicial society in Ukraine. And finally, the largest and most powerful of the oligarchs are being tackled and their influence in society reduced. You'll know from some of our other episodes, and potentially if you've seen the excellent journalist Olga Tokaryuk, that there have been huge changes in the media landscape from the start of the war last year. The government centralized some of the largest media players in order to bring consistency and control to messages that have been put out during the war, and to reduce the potential for Russian influence via the media to undermine the war effort. But what hasn't been publicized so much are new laws that prevent oligarchs from having majority stakes in major media holdings. Some oligarchs have entirely rescinded their ownership or control. Others are still grudgingly holding on to their control of their media empires. But this is a huge change. And if it carries on through the war, in some respects, this puts Ukraine ahead of many Western societies where we know that our own billionaires and extremely wealthy individuals can have huge control over media empires and the influence that potentially follows on with that. And now a story that is very closely associated with that, but it flips things on its head. This is corruption in the EU. Certain Kremlin-linked groups arranged payments to European politicians to support Russia's annexation of Crimea. And we know that the sanctions against Russia were relatively mild after 2014. And there was no major cessation of business in gas, oil, and various resources. So were those decisions made on a rational basis, or were the politicians making those decisions not to really punish Russia in 2014, actually doing so at the behest of the Kremlin via these paid influence programs? It could also be said that if the sanctions were extremely punitive in 2014, that might have dissuaded Putin from going to war in 2022. The amounts involved are not huge. We have to put that into some kind of perspective. It is said that a €68,000 budget was allocated to the project to influence European political figures. And it didn't necessarily go directly into their pockets, but this fund would have arranged trips to occupy Crimea for European politicians and businessmen. It would have covered their travel and accommodation. And of course, it would have arranged meetings with state-funded organizations and individuals who, of course, would have pushed their influence. Now, that is not a huge amount of money, but if it did change people's minds, it's probably one of the best investments in history, because it meant that for a period of 8 years, Russia did not feel a significantly punitive regime of sanctions against it. And Putin was really led to believe that no such sanctions regime would ever be put in place, that the Europeans and, let's not just point the fingers at the Europeans, the UK as well, would not have the stomach to impose a harsh regime of sanctions. That might have emboldened them last year to feel that they could take on the full invasion of Ukraine without consequences. And finally, I'm going to give a quick rundown of 2 articles that appear on the Substack blog of the famous economist Timothy Ash, who's been incredibly vocal throughout this war in support of Ukraine and spoken out against Russian imperialism. There are also 2 excellent videos with Timothy Ash on the channel, which I highly advise you to look at. So in the first article, he says, don't worry about Russian defeat in Ukraine. And why is he bringing this up now? And I think that's because, if we tie it back to the story we covered at the head of this episode, because there has been an uptick in people arguing for peace, demanding that Russia and the West sit down, potentially even to carve out a deal over the heads of the Ukrainians. These voices seem to be increasing in volume and number. And I don't think this is coincidental. I think there must be a pattern behind it. And one of the arguments they use is that if we push much further, if we push Russia to a point of catastrophic defeat, then it makes it almost inevitable that Putin will be removed from power. And the argument goes, whoever comes after him may be much worse. They usually mention Kadyrov and Prigozhin, although it is highly unlikely that either of these individuals would actually come to power. It's much more likely that, like Beria in the 1950s, they would be taken out relatively quickly by others within the regime. And it's claimed that we should fear the collapse and disintegration of Russia, which is by no means certain. In fact, that is still, I believe, quite an unlikely event to happen. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 unleashed some terrible chaos. And to an extent, it's out of that chaos that Putin emerged. So the argument goes is we should leave the current regime intact. That at least is better, the devil you know. Timothy Ash makes the case, and I think it's a compelling one, that Russia needs to change. Russian political system, not regime change, but systemic change needs to happen. And Russia needs to move away from its aggressive, imperial, militaristic mindset. And the only way to do that is to inflict a catastrophic defeat and give that system a real wake-up call. So Timothy makes the case that the argument for peace is not just being pushed by people who have an enlightened interest in the matter, but it's being pushed by the usual pro-Russian agents and appeasers. And at the same time, many of these same voices will not point the finger of blame at Putin directly. They do not point the finger of blame for the aggression and the genocidal rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin at Russia. They seek to divide the blame, and in some instances, place the blame entirely on NATO and the US. Now, there's certainly a discussion to be had about the role of NATO, Britain, the US, and its allies, and the mistakes that were made through the 90s and 2000s. But to abdicate blame for what is happening now, for Russian expansionism, imperialism, war crimes, and genocide, to exonerate Putin from the decisions he made that have led to these, is certainly to do a disservice to both the truth and to Ukraine. There's another motive, Timothy suggests here, behind these voices calling for peace, and that is to say, well, how will peace be possible if you continue to arm Ukraine? So what they're trying to achieve here is to encourage the West to stop arming Ukraine, with the idea, the bogus idea, that that will somehow lead to peace, make a peace treaty more likely. Well, I think those who've studied Putin know that weakness is like red rag to a bull to him. So stopping arming Ukraine is, in Timothy's view, tantamount to ensuring Ukrainian defeat and destruction of that country. He continues, and he makes it quite clear where blame lies. If Russia ends up getting defeated in Ukraine, well, that is because of Putin and Russia's decisions. Putin started this war, and it's within Putin's power to end this war. There is an off-ramp for Putin. There has always been an off-ramp for Putin. We should not feel obliged to secure some kind of win for Putin. He can end this war at any time. There is a clear off-ramp for him, and he controls the informational space in Russia. So he can label the withdrawal as a win. He can say whatever he likes about it, and a large majority of the Russian people will almost certainly buy that message and be relieved that the war is at an end. Timothy says here we should not be Putin or Russia's social worker or psychiatrist. And I think that's true. I mean, Russia, if it's going to learn the lessons of this war, is going to have to work those through itself. A solution cannot be imposed on Russia, no matter what. Timothy then goes on to point out the various reasons why pulling our punches and trying to prevent Russian defeat is ridiculous. And of course, first amongst those is we should not be rewarding the aggressor that shows violence, terror, and intimidation. And above all, we should not be rewarding a country that has committed obscene acts of genocide and violence. Secondly, few countries, even those that apparently are its allies, are actually backing Russia up in any significant way. We know there is trade taking place, but very few countries are actually providing armaments to the Russian war machine. And I think that sort of says something about the lack of support for Russia's actions over the last year or so. Thirdly, he points out that Russia is now inevitably set on a course of instability, decline, and potentially disintegration. And again, that is a process which Russia itself needs to embark upon, and it needs to work through that with its own people. We, the West, are not responsible for political trends in Russia. Putin and the Russians are. But at the same time, we should not think that our actions really have much sway in determining how this situation ends in Russia. And I think that's one of the real problems. Those that blame the West, those that blame NATO for the current problems are ascribing far too much power and influence to the West and its institutions. It's a bit like those that say that the Revolution of Dignity was really sort of managed and brought about by the CIA. are really ascribing far too much power and influence to that organization. And the final article of Timothy's that we're going to look at, and this one harks back to something we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and that is decisive battles are looming in Ukraine. There are rumors that a wave of Russian escalation through asymmetric channels, cyber attacks on the West, propaganda, information, useful idiots, etc. There is certainly another huge wave of this information assault that is already being unleashed. This could have an impact on global markets, but it also could be linked to events that Russia is planning. We're coming up to the first anniversary of the start of the invasion, and we know that dates are incredibly important for Putin. They hold an almost mystical significance for him and his regime. So on the first anniversary of the war, it would not be surprising if Russia didn't launch some kind of major offensive or initiative to grab the headlines. At the same time, Dmitry Medvedev and others are once again talking about red lines. This time, it's about Western tanks and heavy armor, and of course, the fear on the Russian side that fighter planes will be provided, as well as more and longer range missile systems. This, the Russians say, is the final, ultimate red line. But Timothy Ash does not buy that. How many red lines of Putin have come and gone, and nothing has really happened? Each one slips by as if it was a pivotal tipping point, and then there's nothing except retribution against civilians. There's the sinking of the Moskva, the Ukrainian wins in Lyman and Kherson, the supply of ever more sophisticated Western equipment. There's potentially the MiG-29s that were handed over by Eastern Europe, T-72s, refurbished T-72s, tanks, other equipments. Then there was HIMARS, Leopards, Challengers, and Abrams. Each of these red lines has passed and gone, and there has been no significant escalation against the West from the Russia side. Timothy asks, why has Russia not bombed NATO arms convoys? Apart from that one stray missile that seems accidental, potentially, that strayed into Poland, there has been no significant escalation. And in fact, Timothy suggests here that Russia has lost the escalation dominance. Now, I have no doubt that if he thought he could get away with it, if he thought there would be no retribution, Putin would use nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons. But other people have red lines too. And it seems that China and India would not stomach the use of nuclear weapons, even in a limited sense. So Putin may not be able to go there for fear of losing his last remaining allies and support. We also know that China fears the impact on global markets that potential escalation by Russia would have. In fact, they may well be terrified of that and the instability it would bring to the world economic system and potentially to the Chinese domestic political environment as well. Timothy continues, more likely, he thinks, is that we will see military escalation within Ukraine itself. It's claimed that Russia now has 350,000 troops in Ukraine and around 150,000 across the border distributed amongst the various military bases near Ukraine. That is close to double what they had in the total initial invasion. But we have to ask, how much equipment do they have? What are their uniforms and kit like? And what training have they got? That could prove decisive. And Timothy concludes, at the moment, Putin is negotiating from a position of weakness, potentially. He won't want to do that. He wants to change that dynamic, and he wants to have some kind of leverage over Ukraine when potentially talks begin. That means Russia, as we mentioned earlier, may have to launch an offensive sooner rather than later before the arrival of hundreds of Western tanks and the training which is now underway on those systems. The window could be closing for the Russians to have any kind of a movement on the front line that they could label as a victory. At the same time, will Ukraine be prepared to negotiate? That seems highly unlikely, and there are also rumors of a new Ukrainian offensive for the spring that is currently under preparation. Timothy suggests that the Russian offensive may launch as soon as this month, and of course, Ukraine will have factored that in. They will potentially be expecting that. They may even try to take advantage of the Russian offensive to split Russian forces, perhaps with a thrust south through Zaporizhia to cut the land corridor to Crimea for Russia and the crucial supply lines that that contains. Timothy concludes saying, and I think this is absolutely correct, that the next couple of months will be absolutely critical in defining this war and critical in defining whether it lasts for months or longer, whether it's confined to Ukraine itself or whether it spills out into Europe. So this episode is slightly more extensive than the last one. Do let me know what you think. We're planning to make this into a weekly format because the dozens of comments that were left on the channel suggest that this would be the best thing for people. Thank you for tuning in, and please do look out for the next episode where we'll be looking at the NAFO phenomenon, the meme warfare activism movement, and hopefully many of you who are in that will tune in, and those who have not come across the phenomenon will discover something they might want to get involved in. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.